Question 1. The performance metrics show a recurring pattern of disputes within the community of Mobile, Alabama, concerning land inheritance. These disputes often escalate, leading to prolonged family estrangement and economic hardship. A mediator is called in to assist the families. Considering the principles of African customary law and its concept of justice, which of the following approaches would best facilitate a resolution that is both fair and sustainable for the community? Option A. Facilitate a dialogue between the disputing parties, encouraging them to reach a consensus that respects ancestral traditions and familial obligations, drawing upon the principles of restorative justice. Option B. Prioritize a resolution that maximizes the economic benefit for the individual parties involved, irrespective of familial ties or community standing. Option C. Apply the statutory inheritance laws of Alabama to determine the rightful heirs and distribution of the land, regardless of customary practices. Option D. Defer the final decision entirely to the community elders without a structured mediation process to ensure impartiality. Correct answer is A. Facilitate a dialogue between the disputing parties, encouraging them to reach a consensus that respects ancestral traditions and familial obligations, drawing upon the principles of restorative justice. Explanation. The performance metrics show a recurring pattern of disputes within the community of Mobile, Alabama, concerning land inheritance. These disputes often escalate, leading to prolonged family estrangement and economic hardship, which negatively impacts the community's overall well-being. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating the complexities of African customary law as it intersects with modern legal realities in Alabama, demanding a nuanced understanding of justice beyond formal legal pronouncements. The challenge lies in identifying a resolution that respects traditional values while ensuring fairness and preventing further discord. The best approach involves a mediator who facilitates a dialogue between the disputing parties, drawing upon the principles of restorative justice inherent in African customary law. This method emphasizes reconciliation, community harmony, and the restoration of relationships, rather than solely focusing on assigning blame or distributing assets according to a rigid legal framework. Such an approach aligns with the core concept of justice in African customary law, which prioritizes the collective good and the maintenance of social cohesion. By encouraging open communication and seeking a consensus that honors ancestral traditions and familial obligations, the mediator can guide the parties towards a resolution that is perceived as just by the community. This respects the customary legal framework by acknowledging its emphasis on communal well-being and the resolution of disputes through consensus and reconciliation. An approach that solely relies on applying the statutory inheritance laws of Alabama without considering the customary practices of the involved families would be professionally unacceptable. This fails to acknowledge the specific legal and cultural context of the community, potentially leading to a judgment that, while legally sound under state law, is perceived as unjust and disruptive within the customary framework. This disregards the foundational principles of African customary law, that justice is deeply intertwined with social harmony and familial relationships. Another professionally unacceptable approach would be to dismiss the customary claims entirely and impose a resolution based on the perceived economic benefit to the individuals involved, without regard for familial obligations or community standing. This prioritizes individual gain over the collective good and the established norms of the customary legal system, fundamentally misinterpreting the concept of justice as understood within African customary law, which is inherently relational and community-oriented. A third professionally unacceptable approach would be to delegate the decision-making entirely to the elders of the community without any structured mediation process. While elders are respected, their decisions might not always be impartial or fully informed of all parties' perspectives, potentially leading to outcomes that do not achieve true reconciliation or address the underlying causes of the dispute, thereby failing to uphold the comprehensive concept of justice. Professionals facing similar situations should employ a decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the specific customary laws and practices relevant to the parties involved. This should be followed by an assessment of how these customary principles align with or diverge from the applicable statutory laws. The professional should then prioritize a resolution method that facilitates dialogue, respects traditional values, and aims for reconciliation and community harmony, ensuring that the concept of justice is interpreted and applied within its appropriate cultural and legal context. Question 2. Quality control measures reveal that a financial advisor in Alabama is providing advice to a client who states they are in a customary union. The advisor needs to determine the appropriate course of action regarding the client's financial planning, considering the different types of marriages recognized or potentially recognized under Alabama law. Which of the following approaches best addresses this situation? Option A. Advise the client as if they are unmarried, as customary unions are not explicitly recognized as legal marriages in Alabama. Option B. Advise the client based on the specific legal recognition and implications of their customary union within Alabama, recommending consultation with an Alabama licensed attorney specializing in family or probate law if the legal status is unclear. Option C. Assume the customary union is legally equivalent to a monogamous marriage under Alabama law for all financial planning purposes. Option D. Apply the legal framework for polygamous marriages to the client's situation, as customary unions may involve multiple partners. The correct answer is B. Advise the client based on the specific legal recognition and implications of their customary union within Alabama, recommending consultation with an Alabama licensed attorney specializing in family or probate law if the legal status is unclear. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an understanding of the nuanced legal recognition of different marriage types within Alabama, specifically concerning customary unions. A financial advisor must navigate the potential for differing legal statuses and inheritance rights associated with monogamous, polygamous, and customary marriages under Alabama law, ensuring compliance with all relevant statutes and ethical obligations to the client. Misinterpreting or misapplying these distinctions could lead to significant legal and financial repercussions for the client and potential professional liability for the advisor. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves accurately identifying the type of marriage the client has entered into according to Alabama law and advising based on that specific legal classification. This means understanding that while Alabama recognizes monogamous marriages and has historically acknowledged polygamous marriages entered into elsewhere under certain conditions, the legal standing of customary unions, particularly those not explicitly codified or recognized by Alabama statutes, requires careful legal scrutiny. The advisor must prioritize seeking clarification on the specific customary union's legal validity and implications within Alabama, potentially by recommending the client consult with legal counsel specializing in family law or probate law in Alabama. This approach ensures that advice is grounded in the specific legal framework of Alabama, respecting the client's marital status and its associated rights and obligations, thereby upholding the duty of care and professional integrity. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that all customary unions are automatically recognized with the same legal standing as a monogamous marriage under Alabama law. This fails to acknowledge that Alabama's marriage laws primarily focus on monogamous unions and may not explicitly grant full legal recognition to all forms of customary unions, especially if they conflict with public policy or are not adequately documented or proven. This can lead to incorrect assumptions about inheritance, property rights, and beneficiary designations. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the customary union entirely and advise the client as if they were unmarried or in a non-legally recognized union without proper investigation. This disregards the potential for a customary union to have some degree of legal recognition or enforceability under specific circumstances or through common law principles, and it fails to uphold the advisor's duty to understand the client's full personal and financial circumstances. A further incorrect approach is to apply the legal principles of polygamous marriages to a customary union without a clear understanding of whether the customary union is, in fact, polygamous, and whether Alabama law would recognize such a union under the specific circumstances presented. Alabama law's stance on polygamy is complex and often tied to its recognition of marriages validly entered into in other jurisdictions, and conflating it with a customary union without proper legal analysis is an error. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Alabama should adopt a risk-based approach when dealing with non-traditional marital arrangements. This involves 1. Proactive inquiry into the client's marital status, specifically asking about the nature and recognition of their union. 2. Researching Alabama's specific statutes and case law pertaining to marriage, including any provisions or judicial interpretations regarding customary unions. 3. Recognizing the limitations of their own expertise and the necessity of consulting with legal professionals when the legal status of a marital union is unclear or potentially complex. 4. Prioritizing client welfare and legal compliance by ensuring all advice is based on a sound understanding of applicable Alabama law, even if it requires additional steps like recommending legal counsel. Question 3. Quality control measures reveal a potential conflict regarding land use within a rural community in Alabama, where historical practices suggest a customary land tenure system may be in operation alongside statutory property law. What is the most appropriate risk assessment approach for the legal counsel advising the community? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive investigation into the specific customary land tenure system by consulting with community elders, recognized customary law practitioners, and seeking specialized legal advice on Alabama property law and customary practices. Option B. Immediately implement a standard statutory land management plan for the area, disregarding any historical land use patterns mentioned by community members. Option C. Rely on the opinions of the most vocal community members regarding land ownership and use to determine the applicable legal framework. Option D. Advise the community that all land in Alabama is exclusively governed by statutory property law, and any customary practices are legally irrelevant. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive investigation into the specific customary land tenure system by consulting with community elders, recognized customary law practitioners, and seeking specialized legal advice on Alabama property law and customary practices. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves navigating the complexities of customary land tenure within Alabama's legal framework, which often intersects with statutory law and individual property rights. The risk lies in misinterpreting or disregarding established customary practices, potentially leading to disputes, legal challenges, and undermining the rights of community members who rely on these traditional systems. Careful judgment is required to balance respect for customary law with the need for clear, legally defensible land management. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough investigation into the specific customary land tenure system in place within the relevant Alabama community. This includes consulting with community elders, recognized customary law practitioners, and potentially seeking legal counsel specializing in Alabama property law and customary practices. The justification for this approach lies in the principle of respecting and upholding established customary rights as recognized, where applicable, within the broader legal landscape of Alabama. Alabama law, while primarily statutory, acknowledges the existence and potential enforceability of customary practices, particularly concerning land use and inheritance, provided they do not conflict with overriding statutory provisions or public policy. A deep understanding of the specific customs is paramount to avoid misapplication of general legal principles. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that all land within Alabama is subject solely to statutory property law, ignoring any potential customary tenure systems. This fails to acknowledge the historical and cultural context of land ownership and use within certain communities, and could lead to the dispossession or disenfranchisement of individuals whose rights are derived from customary practices. This approach violates the ethical obligation to act with due diligence and respect for all stakeholders' rights. Another incorrect approach is to unilaterally impose a statutory land management system without consulting or incorporating the existing customary practices. This demonstrates a lack of cultural sensitivity and a failure to engage in good faith with the affected community. It risks creating significant social friction and legal challenges, as customary rights, even if not formally codified in the same way as statutory rights, may still hold legal weight and be recognized by courts. A further incorrect approach is to rely solely on anecdotal evidence or the opinions of a few individuals within the community, without a systematic and verifiable investigation into the established customary land tenure system. This can lead to incomplete or inaccurate understandings of the customs, resulting in flawed decision-making and potential legal disputes. It fails to meet the professional standard of thoroughness and due diligence required when dealing with sensitive matters of land rights. Professional reasoning, Professionals dealing with land tenure in Alabama should adopt a multifaceted approach. First, they must identify the specific geographic area and the potential existence of customary land tenure systems. Second, they should engage in diligent research, which includes consulting relevant statutory laws of Alabama pertaining to property and land use, as well as seeking to understand the specific customary practices through consultation with community leaders and recognized practitioners. Third, they must assess how these customary practices interact with Alabama statutory law, identifying any potential conflicts or areas of overlap. Finally, any proposed land management or resolution of land disputes must be developed in a manner that respects, and, where legally permissible, upholds the established customary rights of the community members. Question 4. Quality control measures reveal a dispute in an Alabama community concerning land inheritance rights, where the application of African customary law is central. A legal professional is tasked with gathering evidence to support a client's claim. Which of the following methods for identifying and verifying the sources of Alabama African customary law would best mitigate the risk of misinterpretation and ensure a robust, legally defensible position? Option A. Relying solely on the testimony of the immediate family members involved in the dispute, as their personal knowledge of family history is considered the most direct and relevant evidence of customary inheritance practices. Option B. Prioritizing the examination of any written legal codes or historical texts that purport to describe Alabama African customary law, giving minimal weight to oral accounts from community members unless they can be independently verified by a written source. Option C. Conducting extensive interviews with respected community elders and recognized custodians of tradition, observing established community practices related to inheritance, and cross-referencing these findings with any available historical documents or community records that pertain to land inheritance. Option D. Seeking out external academic studies or anthropological research on African customary law in general, and applying those generalized findings to the specific circumstances of the Alabama community, without direct engagement with local community members or their traditions. The correct answer is C. Conducting extensive interviews with respected community elders and recognized custodians of tradition, observing established community practices related to inheritance, and cross-referencing these findings with any available historical documents or community records that pertain to land inheritance. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between established, codified legal principles and the dynamic, often unwritten nature of African customary law as practiced in Alabama. The risk lies in misinterpreting or misapplying the sources of customary law, potentially leading to an unjust outcome or undermining the legitimacy of the customary legal system itself. Careful judgment is required to balance the need for evidence with the unique characteristics of oral traditions and practices. The best approach involves a thorough investigation that prioritizes the most reliable and verifiable sources of Alabama African customary law. This means actively seeking out and documenting oral traditions from respected elders and community leaders, meticulously recording established practices through observation and testimony, and critically evaluating any existing written records for authenticity and relevance to the specific dispute. This method aligns with the fundamental principles of evidence gathering in any legal system, adapted to the specific context of customary law, where oral testimony and demonstrable practice often hold primary evidentiary weight. It respects the established hierarchy of sources within customary law, acknowledging that, while written records can be valuable, they are often secondary to the living traditions and practices of the community. An approach that dismisses oral traditions as unreliable and solely relies on potentially outdated or incomplete written records is professionally unacceptable. This fails to acknowledge the primary role of oral transmission in the preservation and application of African customary law. It also risks overlooking the living, evolving nature of these traditions, which may not be fully captured in any written document. Furthermore, an approach that gives undue weight to the personal interpretations of individuals without corroboration from community elders or established practices ignores the communal and authoritative nature of customary law. This can lead to biased or inaccurate representations of the law, undermining its integrity. Professionals facing similar situations should employ a systematic risk assessment framework. This involves identifying the potential sources of evidence relevant to the specific customary law in question, evaluating the reliability and credibility of each source, and prioritizing those that best reflect the established norms and practices of the community. A critical step is to seek corroboration from multiple sources, particularly when dealing with oral traditions. Understanding the specific context and the established methods of dispute resolution within the relevant customary legal framework is paramount to ensuring a fair and legally sound outcome. Question 5. Governance review demonstrates that a dispute has arisen within an Alabama community with strong African customary law traditions concerning allegations of property damage that have caused significant social friction. The community elders have indicated a preference for resolving this matter through traditional reconciliation processes that focus on restoring harmony and compensating the affected parties in a manner that upholds community honor. What is the most appropriate course of action for external authorities to take? Option A. Advise the community elders that African customary law has no standing in Alabama and that all disputes must be handled exclusively through the state's formal legal system. Option B. Immediately initiate formal criminal proceedings under Alabama law for property damage, disregarding the community's customary dispute resolution preferences. Option C. Propose a hybrid approach where a formal Alabama court hearing is conducted, with a token acknowledgement of customary practices without genuine integration or deference to community leadership. Option D. Support and facilitate the community's preferred reconciliation process, ensuring it operates within the bounds of Alabama public safety and fundamental legal rights, while respecting the authority of community elders in dispute resolution. The correct answer is D. Support and facilitate the community's preferred reconciliation process, ensuring it operates within the bounds of Alabama public safety and fundamental legal rights, while respecting the authority of community elders in dispute resolution. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between upholding the established criminal justice system in Alabama and respecting the deeply ingrained principles of African customary law, particularly concerning dispute resolution and community harmony. The challenge lies in navigating a situation where traditional methods of addressing grievances, often focused on reconciliation and restorative justice, may conflict with the formal legal processes of the state, which emphasize punishment and adherence to codified statutes. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any intervention is both legally sound within Alabama's framework and culturally sensitive to the community's practices. The correct approach involves recognizing the limitations of formal legal intervention when dealing with matters primarily rooted in customary law and prioritizing community-led reconciliation. This means understanding that, while Alabama law provides the overarching legal structure, certain disputes may be more effectively and appropriately resolved through mechanisms that align with African customary law's emphasis on restoring social balance and addressing the harm to the community, rather than solely focusing on individual culpability under state statutes. This approach respects the autonomy of the community to manage its internal affairs within the bounds of public order and safety, and acknowledges that a purely punitive response might exacerbate divisions rather than heal them. The justification lies in the principle of subsidiarity, where issues are best handled at the lowest possible level of governance or social organization, and in the ethical consideration of promoting social cohesion and well-being within the community. An incorrect approach would be to immediately impose the full weight of Alabama's criminal justice system without considering the customary context. This fails to acknowledge the validity and efficacy of customary dispute resolution mechanisms and can be perceived as an imposition of external authority, potentially leading to resentment and a breakdown of trust between the community and external authorities. Such an approach risks alienating the community and may not achieve the desired outcome of true resolution or reconciliation. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the relevance of African customary law entirely and insist on a purely statutory legal process. This demonstrates a lack of cultural understanding and respect for the community's traditions and values. It ignores the potential for customary law to provide a more holistic and sustainable resolution, focusing on the underlying causes of conflict and the restoration of relationships, which are often central to customary justice. A further incorrect approach would be to attempt a superficial integration of customary practices into the formal legal system without a deep understanding of their underlying principles, or without the consent and active participation of the community elders and leaders. This can lead to a misapplication of customary law, undermining its authority and potentially creating new conflicts. It risks trivializing deeply held traditions and may not achieve the restorative goals of customary justice. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the specific dispute and its context within the community. This involves engaging in open dialogue with community leaders and members to ascertain the nature of the issue and the preferred methods of resolution according to African customary law. The next step is to assess whether the dispute falls within the purview of Alabama criminal law, and if so, to what extent. If the matter can be effectively and appropriately resolved through customary means without violating public safety or fundamental legal rights, then facilitating or supporting community-led reconciliation should be prioritized. If the dispute involves serious criminal offenses that require state intervention, the approach should be to work collaboratively with community leaders to ensure that the legal process is conducted with cultural sensitivity and, where possible, incorporates elements of restorative justice that align with customary principles. Question 6. What factors determine the appropriate application of reformed Alabama African customary law in contemporary legal disputes, considering its post-colonial development and integration into the state's legal framework? Option A. The selective and uncoordinated application of both pre-colonial and reformed customary law principles based on perceived fairness in individual cases. Option B. The extent to which the customary law has been formally recognized, codified, or judicially interpreted through post-colonial reforms and legislative enactments within Alabama. Option C. The exclusive application of general Alabama statutory law, disregarding any relevant customary law principles. Option D. The adherence to pre-colonial customary practices, irrespective of any subsequent reforms or legislative changes. The correct answer is B. The extent to which the customary law has been formally recognized, codified, or judicially interpreted through post-colonial reforms and legislative enactments within Alabama. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge in navigating the complex interplay between codified statutory law and the enduring principles of Alabama African customary law, particularly in the context of post-colonial developments and reforms. The difficulty lies in determining the appropriate legal framework to apply when a dispute arises that touches upon both inherited statutory provisions and customary practices that have undergone reform. Professionals must exercise careful judgment to ensure that the chosen approach respects the legal evolution of customary law while adhering to the overarching legal system of Alabama. The risk of misapplying legal principles or disrespecting the legitimate evolution of customary practices necessitates a nuanced and informed decision-making process. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a thorough examination of the specific customary law in question, considering how it has been reformed or codified in post-colonial Alabama. This requires understanding the legislative intent behind any reforms and how these reforms have been integrated or recognized within the broader Alabama legal framework. The approach that prioritizes identifying and applying the most recent, legally recognized, and reformed aspects of Alabama African customary law, as evidenced by judicial precedent or legislative enactments, is the most professionally sound. This is because post-colonial reforms are intended to address historical injustices and adapt customary law to contemporary societal needs and legal standards, ensuring its continued relevance and legitimacy within the state's legal system. Adherence to these reformed principles aligns with the ethical imperative to uphold justice and fairness, recognizing the dynamic nature of law. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to solely rely on pre-colonial customary law without acknowledging or incorporating any post-colonial reforms. This fails to recognize the legal evolution and adaptation that has occurred, potentially leading to the application of outdated or discriminatory practices that have been explicitly reformed. Such an approach would violate the principle of legal progress and could perpetuate historical inequities. Another incorrect approach is to disregard customary law entirely and apply only statutory law, even when the dispute clearly has roots in customary practices. This ignores the legal recognition and integration of reformed customary law within Alabama's legal landscape, thereby failing to provide a comprehensive and just resolution. It also disrespects the cultural heritage and legal traditions of the communities involved. A further incorrect approach is to selectively apply aspects of both pre-colonial and reformed customary law without a clear legal basis or consistent methodology. This can lead to arbitrary decision-making, inconsistency in legal outcomes, and a lack of predictability, undermining the rule of law and the integrity of the legal process. Professional reasoning. Professionals faced with such situations should adopt a systematic approach. First, they must identify the specific customary law principles relevant to the dispute. Second, they must research and understand the history of these principles, paying close attention to any post-colonial reforms, legislative changes, or judicial interpretations that have altered or codified them within Alabama. Third, they should prioritize the application of the most current and legally recognized version of the customary law, as determined by statutory provisions or established case law in Alabama. If there is ambiguity, seeking guidance from legal scholars specializing in Alabama's customary law or consulting relevant legal authorities is advisable. The ultimate goal is to achieve a resolution that is both legally sound and ethically just, respecting the evolution of law and the rights of all parties involved. Question 7. Strategic planning requires a thorough understanding of the historical forces that have shaped legal traditions. When examining the role of colonialism in the development of African customary law in Alabama, which of the following analytical approaches best reflects a responsible and accurate scholarly engagement with this complex topic? Option A. Prioritize the theoretical ideals of pre-colonial African customary law as the sole benchmark for understanding its current status, disregarding the practical adaptations made under colonial influence. Option B. Analyze how specific colonial policies and administrative actions in Alabama directly altered, codified, or enforced African customary laws, thereby influencing their contemporary form and practice. Option C. Assume that African customary law in Alabama has remained largely unaffected by colonial rule, preserving its pre-colonial structure and principles in their original form. Option D. Accept colonial-era interpretations and records of African customary law as the most authoritative and objective accounts, without critical examination of their inherent biases. The correct answer is B. Analyze how specific colonial policies and administrative actions in Alabama directly altered, codified, or enforced African customary laws, thereby influencing their contemporary form and practice. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a legal scholar or practitioner engaging with Alabama's African customary law due to the complex legacy of colonialism. The challenge lies in navigating the tension between pre-colonial customary practices and the legal and social structures imposed by colonial powers, which often distorted or suppressed indigenous legal systems. Careful judgment is required to avoid perpetuating colonial biases or misinterpreting the current state of customary law as a direct, unadulterated continuation of its pre-colonial form. The best approach involves a nuanced examination of how colonial policies and actions directly influence the evolution and application of African customary law in Alabama. This includes identifying specific instances where colonial administrators altered, codified, or enforced customary laws in ways that served colonial interests, thereby shaping their present-day manifestations. This approach is correct because it acknowledges the historical context and its direct impact on the legal framework, aligning with the ethical imperative to understand and respect the historical development of legal systems without imposing external, anachronistic judgments. It recognizes that customary law is not static but has been dynamically shaped by historical forces, including colonialism. An incorrect approach would be to assume that African customary law in Alabama remains entirely unchanged from its pre-colonial state, ignoring the profound impact of colonial intervention. This fails to acknowledge the historical reality and risks, presenting an inaccurate and potentially disrespectful portrayal of the legal system. Another incorrect approach would be to uncritically adopt colonial interpretations of customary law as definitive, thereby perpetuating the very biases and distortions introduced during the colonial era. This approach disregards the agency of indigenous communities and their ability to adapt and maintain their legal traditions, even under duress. Finally, an approach that focuses solely on the theoretical purity of pre-colonial law without considering its practical application and evolution under colonial rule would be incomplete and misleading. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes historical accuracy, ethical sensitivity, and a deep understanding of power dynamics. This involves rigorous research into colonial archives, ethnographic studies, and contemporary legal practices, always questioning the origins and motivations behind the codification or enforcement of specific customary laws. It requires a commitment to decolonizing legal analysis by centering the perspectives and experiences of those whose laws have been historically marginalized. Question 8. Strategic planning requires a community elder in rural Alabama to mediate a land dispute where one family bases their claim on generations of oral tradition and ancestral connection, while the other family presents a colonial-era written deed. What is the most ethically sound and culturally appropriate method for the elder to resolve this conflict, respecting the principles of African customary law within the Alabama context? Option A. Facilitate a dialogue where both families present their historical narratives and work collaboratively towards a mutually agreeable solution that acknowledges the significance of both oral traditions and the written deed. Option B. Prioritize the oral traditions as the sole basis for resolution, disregarding the legal standing of the written deed. Option C. Uphold the written deed as the definitive legal document and dismiss the oral traditions as unsubstantiated claims. Option D. Impose a decision based on the elder's personal interpretation of historical events, without extensive dialogue or consensus building. The correct answer is A. Facilitate a dialogue where both families present their historical narratives and work collaboratively towards a mutually agreeable solution that acknowledges the significance of both oral traditions and the written deed. Explanation. Strategic planning requires careful consideration of ethical dilemmas that arise in traditional conflict resolution. In Alabama, where African customary law may intersect with state legal frameworks, a community elder is tasked with mediating a land dispute between two families. One family, the plaintiffs, claims ancestral land based on oral traditions passed down through generations. The defendants, however, present a written deed from the colonial era, which, while potentially valid under Alabama law, contradicts the oral history. The challenge lies in balancing the respect for customary law and community harmony with the legal enforceability of written documents. Best approach involves acknowledging the validity of both claims while prioritizing a resolution that upholds the spirit of African customary law in Alabama. This means facilitating a dialogue where both families can present their narratives and historical understanding of the land. The elder should guide the discussion towards a mutually agreeable solution that respects the ancestral claims and the community's historical connection to the land, potentially through shared usage, symbolic recognition, or a compromise that acknowledges the oral tradition's significance. This aligns with the ethical imperative of preserving cultural heritage and fostering reconciliation within the community, which is a cornerstone of traditional conflict resolution. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the written deed and dismiss the oral traditions. This fails to recognize the deep cultural and historical significance of ancestral land within African customary law and could alienate one of the families, leading to lasting resentment and further conflict. It prioritizes a formal legalistic interpretation over community well-being and reconciliation. Another incorrect approach would be to exclusively validate the oral traditions and disregard the written deed entirely. While respecting customary law is important, completely ignoring a legally recognized document could create future legal complications and undermine the elder's authority by appearing to disregard established legal processes, even if those processes are not the primary focus of customary resolution. A further incorrect approach would be to impose a decision without adequate dialogue or consensus building. Traditional methods emphasize participation and agreement. Imposing a solution, even if seemingly fair, bypasses the community's inherent right to self-determination in resolving their disputes and can lead to a superficial resolution that does not address the underlying grievances. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the cultural context and the specific customary laws at play. They must then identify the core interests of all parties involved, not just their stated positions. Facilitating open and respectful communication, exploring various resolution options that honor both customary and formal legal principles where applicable, and striving for a consensus-based outcome are crucial steps in ensuring a just and sustainable resolution. Question 9. Strategic planning requires a legal advisor in Alabama to address a land inheritance dispute where the parties involved cite differing interpretations of ancestral customary laws regarding primogeniture versus equal division among siblings. Considering the historical context and sources of African customary law in Alabama, what is the most appropriate course of action for the advisor? Option A. Immediately apply Alabama's statutory inheritance laws, disregarding any claims based on customary practices, as statutory law is the supreme legal authority. Option B. Prioritize the interpretation of customary law that appears most favorable to the party who initially engaged the advisor's services, without independent verification or consideration of broader community norms. Option C. Thoroughly research the specific historical precedents and recognize practices of African customary law concerning inheritance within the relevant Alabama communities. Consult with community elders or recognized custodians of tradition to understand their interpretations, and then seek to reconcile these customary norms with contemporary principles of fairness and equity. Option D. Arbitrarily combine elements of customary law and statutory law, based on the advisor's personal judgment, to create a novel resolution. The correct answer is C. Thoroughly research the specific historical precedents and recognized practices of African customary law concerning inheritance within the relevant Alabama communities. Consult with community elders or recognized custodians of tradition to understand their interpretations, and then seek to reconcile these customary norms with contemporary principles of fairness and equity. Explanation. The scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires navigating the intersection of modern legal principles and deeply ingrained customary practices within Alabama's African customary law context. The challenge lies in respecting the historical and cultural significance of customary law while ensuring adherence to contemporary legal and ethical standards, particularly concerning fairness and due process. Careful judgment is required to avoid imposing external legal frameworks rigidly or disregarding established customary norms entirely. The best professional approach involves a thorough investigation into the specific customary laws and practices relevant to the dispute, consulting with recognized elders or custodians of tradition, and then seeking to reconcile these customary norms with the overarching principles of justice and equity as understood within the broader legal framework of Alabama. This approach is correct because it acknowledges the validity and importance of African customary law as a source of legal understanding and dispute resolution within its specific context, as recognized historically and in certain applications within Alabama. It prioritizes understanding the roots and application of these customs before making any determination, thereby respecting the historical context and the lived reality of the parties involved. This aligns with the ethical imperative to act with cultural sensitivity and to seek resolutions that are both legally sound and socially acceptable within the community. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the customary law entirely and insist on applying only statutory or common law principles without any consideration for the historical context or the parties' expectations based on their customary background. This fails to recognize African customary law as a legitimate source of legal understanding and practice in Alabama, ignoring its historical roots and the potential for its principles to inform equitable outcomes. It demonstrates a lack of cultural competence and can lead to unjust or unenforceable decisions. Another incorrect approach would be to blindly apply customary law without critically examining its fairness or its compatibility with fundamental legal principles of due process and individual rights. While respecting custom is important, it cannot supersede fundamental legal protections. This approach risks perpetuating potentially discriminatory or unfair practices that may have existed historically, but are no longer considered just or legal. A further incorrect approach would be to attempt to blend customary law and statutory law in an arbitrary or superficial manner, without a deep understanding of either. This superficial integration can lead to confusion, inconsistency, and a failure to achieve a just resolution. It lacks the rigorous analysis required to properly apply or reconcile different legal traditions. The professional reasoning process should involve first identifying the relevant customary laws and their historical context within Alabama. This requires diligent research and consultation. Second, it necessitates an understanding of the applicable statutory and common law principles. Third, a critical evaluation of how these two legal systems interact, identifying areas of potential conflict and harmony. Finally, the professional must strive for a resolution that is informed by the historical context of African customary law, respects its principles where appropriate and just, and fully complies with the contemporary legal and ethical obligations within Alabama. Question 10. Quality control measures reveal a discrepancy in the valuation of a parcel of land in rural Alabama, historically subject to evolving African customary law. The valuation needs to reflect the economic impact of these historical customary practices on potential future resource yields. If the projected annual net income from the land, adjusted for inflation, is expected to be $50,000 in perpetuity, and the standard market discount rate is 8%, but historical analysis suggests a 2% increased risk of resource access disputes due to the legacy of customary land allocation. What is the adjusted present value of the land's future income stream? Option A, $625,000, calculated by using the standard market discount rate of 8% and assuming the 2% risk is negligible. Option B, $500,000, calculated by adjusting the discount rate to 10% to account for the 2% increased risk, using the perpetuity formula PV equals frac CR. Option C, $500,000, calculated by applying a 2% reduction to the projected annual income before using the perpetuity formula with the standard discount rate. Option D, $625,000, calculated by using the standard market discount rate of 8% and adding a one-time 2% premium to the initial income. Correct answer is B, $500,000, calculated by adjusting the discount rate to 10% to account for the 2% increased risk, using the perpetuity formula PV equals frac CR. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an understanding of how historical shifts in land ownership and resource allocation, influenced by the evolution of customary law in Alabama's African communities, impact current economic valuations. The challenge lies in quantifying the intangible historical contributions and rights that may not be reflected in formal land deeds, but are recognized within the framework of customary law. Accurate valuation necessitates a nuanced approach that bridges formal legal recognition with the historical realities of customary practices. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves calculating the present value of projected future income streams derived from the land, adjusted by a risk factor that accounts for the historical precedent of customary land rights and their potential impact on future resource access and utilization. This method directly addresses the core of the valuation challenge by incorporating the economic implications of historical customary law. The formula for present value PV of a perpetuity with growth is \PV equals frac C1RG where C1 is the cash flow in the next period, R is the discount rate, and G is the growth rate. The risk adjustment would be applied to the discount rate R or as a multiplier to the final PV, reflecting the uncertainty introduced by the historical evolution of customary law. This approach is justified by the need to provide a valuation that is both economically sound and legally informed, acknowledging that customary law, even if not always formally codified in modern deeds, has historically shaped and continues to influence resource rights and economic potential in these communities. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the current market value of the land based on formal deeds and recent comparable sales, ignoring any historical claims or customary rights. This fails to acknowledge the regulatory and ethical imperative to consider all relevant factors influencing the land's economic potential, particularly in contexts where historical customary law has established a precedent for resource access and distribution that may not be fully captured by formal title. This approach risks undervaluing the asset and potentially leading to inequitable outcomes. Another incorrect approach would be to simply add a fixed percentage premium to the market value to account for historical significance without a quantifiable basis. This lacks the rigor required for a professional valuation. The historical evolution of customary law in Alabama's African communities has specific economic implications that need to be analyzed and quantified, not arbitrarily assigned. This method is ethically questionable as it is not based on a sound analytical framework and could lead to misrepresentation of the land's true economic value. A third incorrect approach would be to discount the land's value based on the perceived instability or lack of formal recognition of customary law. While acknowledging potential risks is important, a blanket discount without a thorough analysis of how historical customary law has shaped actual resource use and economic activity is unprofessional and potentially discriminatory. The historical evolution of customary law has established patterns of resource management and benefit sharing that, while perhaps informal, have tangible economic consequences that must be assessed, not dismissed. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must adopt a decision-making process that prioritizes a comprehensive understanding of the legal and historical context. This involves 1. Thoroughly researching the historical evolution of African customary law in Alabama and its impact on land tenure and resource rights. 2. Identifying all relevant stakeholders and their historical and present claims. 3. Employing valuation methodologies that can quantify the economic implications of these historical factors, such as discounted cash flow analysis adjusted for risk. 4. Ensuring transparency and ethical conduct by clearly articulating the assumptions and methodologies used in the valuation, particularly when historical customary law is a significant factor. Question 11. Quality control measures reveal a need to clarify the understanding of African customary law within the context of Alabama's legal framework. A legal practitioner is presented with a case involving a dispute over family inheritance among individuals who identify with specific African traditions. To accurately advise their client and ensure compliance with Alabama law, what is the most appropriate definition and scope of African customary law to consider? Option A. African customary law is an outdated and irrelevant legal system that has no bearing on the modern jurisprudence of Alabama and should be disregarded in all legal matters within the state. Option B. African customary law is a universal set of legal principles applicable to all individuals of African descent residing in Alabama, governing all aspects of their personal and familial lives, irrespective of specific community traditions or Alabama's legal recognition. Option C. African customary law refers to the unwritten rules and principles derived from the traditions, customs, and practices of African communities, recognized and applied by those communities, with its scope in Alabama limited to areas where it has been historically recognized or specifically given effect by Alabama law, provided it does not conflict with Alabama's public policy or statutory law. Option D. African customary law encompasses any practice or tradition described as customary by an individual of African heritage, which is automatically deemed legally enforceable within Alabama's court system. The correct answer is C. African customary law refers to the unwritten rules and principles derived from the traditions, customs, and practices of African communities, recognized and applied by those communities, with its scope in Alabama limited to areas where it has been historically recognized or specifically given effect by Alabama law, provided it does not conflict with Alabama's public policy or statutory law. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an understanding of how to integrate a potentially unfamiliar legal system, African customary law, into the established legal framework of Alabama. The challenge lies in accurately defining the scope and application of customary law without overstepping its recognized boundaries or misinterpreting its principles within the context of Alabama's statutory and common law. Misapplication could lead to legal disputes, unfair outcomes for individuals, and a failure to uphold the rule of law. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the application of customary law is both legally sound and ethically appropriate. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a precise definition of African customary law as it pertains to the specific context of Alabama, recognizing it as a body of unwritten rules and principles derived from the traditions, customs, and practices of African communities, which are recognized and applied by those communities in their social and legal relations. This approach correctly identifies that its scope is limited to those areas where it has been historically recognized, or where specific legislation or judicial precedent in Alabama has given it effect, often in matters of personal status, family law, or inheritance, provided it does not conflict with Alabama's public policy or statutory law. This aligns with the principle of respecting diverse legal traditions while ensuring consistency with the overarching legal system. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to broadly interpret African customary law as a universal set of rules applicable to all individuals of African descent in Alabama, regardless of their specific community's traditions or the absence of legal recognition within Alabama. This fails to acknowledge that customary law is community-specific and requires a nexus to Alabama's legal system for its application. Risks imposing rules that are not legally binding or relevant in the jurisdiction. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss African customary law entirely as irrelevant to Alabama's legal system, treating it as a foreign or primitive system that has no place in modern jurisprudence. This demonstrates a lack of cultural competency and a failure to recognize the potential for customary law to inform or coexist with statutory law in specific, recognized circumstances, thereby potentially denying individuals the benefit of their established traditions where legally permissible. A further incorrect approach would be to assume that any practice described as customary by an individual automatically qualifies as legally enforceable African customary law within Alabama. This overlooks the requirement for such customs to be established, reasonable, and not contrary to Alabama's public policy or statutory provisions. It risks validating practices that may be harmful or legally impermissible under Alabama law. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach questions of jurisdiction and the application of customary law by first identifying the specific legal system in question, Alabama. They must then ascertain whether African customary law has been recognized or incorporated into that system through legislation or judicial precedent. The definition and scope of such recognized customary law must be precisely understood, focusing on its traditional sources and its limitations within the governing jurisdiction. Professionals should consult relevant statutes, case law, and scholarly interpretations specific to Alabama to determine the boundaries of customary law's applicability. Ethical considerations demand respect for cultural diversity while upholding the supremacy of the established legal framework and ensuring that any application of customary law is fair, just, and consistent with public policy. Question 12. Benchmark analysis indicates a dispute has arisen within an Alabama community concerning land inheritance, with differing interpretations of ancestral lineage claims. What is the most appropriate course of action for a legal practitioner to ensure adherence to the principles of Alabama African customary law? Option A. Thoroughly research and apply the specific customary law principles governing land inheritance in that particular Alabama community, consulting with recognized community elders and custodians of tradition to facilitate a resolution consistent with established customary practices and values. Option B. Introduce relevant precedents from other African customary law systems or general principles of inheritance law from outside the specific Alabama community to guide the resolution. Option C. Facilitate a resolution based on the immediate expressed desires and agreements of the disputing parties, without extensive consultation with community elders or reference to historical customary practices. Option D. Advise the parties that the dispute is too complex for customary law and recommend immediate recourse to the state court system for a definitive ruling. The correct answer is A. Thoroughly research and apply the specific customary law principles governing land inheritance in that particular Alabama community, consulting with recognized community elders and custodians of tradition to facilitate a resolution consistent with established customary practices and values. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between the established principles of Alabama African customary law and the potential for external influences or interpretations that might not align with its core tenets. Navigating this requires a deep understanding of the customary legal framework and a commitment to upholding its integrity. The best approach involves a thorough examination of the specific customary law principles applicable to the dispute, consulting with recognized elders or custodians of tradition within the relevant community, and facilitating a resolution that is consistent with established customary practices and values. This approach is correct because it directly adheres to the foundational principles of African customary law as practiced in Alabama, prioritizing the wisdom and authority of community elders and the established norms of the society. This aligns with the spirit of customary law, which is rooted in community consensus, tradition, and the guidance of those who embody its historical understanding. An incorrect approach would be to prioritize the introduction of external legal concepts or precedents from other jurisdictions, without a clear understanding of their compatibility with Alabama's African customary law. This is ethically and regulatorily flawed because it risks undermining the autonomy and distinctiveness of the customary legal system, potentially imposing foreign norms that are not rooted in the community's historical context or values. Such an action could lead to a misapplication of law and a loss of faith in the customary system. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the dispute outright, deeming it too minor or outside the purview of customary law without proper consideration. This is professionally unacceptable, as it fails to acknowledge the importance of all community matters within the customary framework and neglects the duty to provide a forum for dispute resolution as dictated by tradition. It demonstrates a lack of respect for the customary legal process and the needs of the community. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to seek a resolution based solely on the personal opinions of the parties involved, without recourse to established customary principles or the guidance of elders. This is problematic because customary law is not a matter of individual whim, but a collective understanding and practice. Relying only on personal opinions bypasses the established mechanisms for ensuring fairness, consistency, and adherence to tradition, thereby eroding the legitimacy of the customary legal system. Professionals should approach such situations by first identifying the specific customary legal framework governing the matter. This involves understanding the relevant traditions, customs, and the roles of community leaders. The next step is to engage with the community, particularly elders or custodians of customary law, to gain their insights and ensure any proposed resolution is in harmony with established practices. This iterative process of understanding, consultation, and application ensures that decisions are both legally sound within the customary context and ethically grounded in community values. Question 13. The assessment process reveals a situation where individuals claim to be married under the customary laws of their specific African heritage, which they assert have been observed for generations. When seeking to have this marital status recognized or addressed within Alabama, what is the most appropriate course of action for a legal professional to take? Option A. Disregard the customary practices entirely, deeming them irrelevant to the legal determination of marital status within Alabama, and insist on a formal state-recognized ceremony. Option B. Ascertain the specific requirements for a valid marriage under Alabama law and evaluate whether the customary practices, when interpreted through the framework of Alabama statutes and case law, fulfill these legal prerequisites. Option C. Apply the marriage laws and customs of the specific African country of origin as the definitive standard for marital validity within Alabama. Option D. Automatically recognize the marriage as valid based on the individual's assertion of adherence to their ancestral customary laws, assuming these practices inherently confer marital status. The correct answer is B. Ascertain the specific requirements for a valid marriage under Alabama law and evaluate whether the customary practices, when interpreted through the framework of Alabama statutes and case law, fulfill these legal prerequisites. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a scenario that is professionally challenging due to the inherent complexities of applying Alabama's legal framework to customary marriage practices that may originate from diverse African cultures. Professionals must exercise careful judgment to navigate potential conflicts between established state law and deeply rooted cultural traditions, ensuring that any legal recognition or interpretation respects both the rights of individuals and the integrity of the legal system. The core challenge lies in determining how Alabama law, which governs marriage, interacts with customs that might not align with its formal requirements for validity. The best professional approach involves a thorough understanding and application of Alabama's specific marriage statutes and case law, coupled with a culturally sensitive inquiry into the nature of the customary practice. This approach prioritizes adherence to established legal principles while acknowledging the existence and significance of customary practices. It requires investigating whether the customary practice, when examined through the lens of Alabama law, meets the essential elements of a legally recognized marriage, such as intent, capacity, and consent, and whether it has been solemnized in a manner that Alabama law would recognize or permit. This is correct because it grounds the assessment in the governing jurisdiction's legal framework, which is paramount for any legal determination within Alabama. It avoids imposing external legal standards and instead seeks to understand how the customary practice fits, or does not fit, within the existing legal structure. An incorrect approach would be to automatically validate a customary marriage solely based on its observance within a specific African culture, without assessing its compliance with Alabama's legal requirements for marriage. This fails to uphold the supremacy of Alabama law in defining marital status within the state. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss or disregard the customary practice entirely, labeling it as legally irrelevant without a proper examination of whether it might, in some circumstances, satisfy the underlying legal principles of marriage as understood by Alabama law, such as mutual consent and commitment. This demonstrates a lack of cultural competency and an overly rigid adherence to form over substance, potentially leading to unjust outcomes. A further incorrect approach would be to apply the laws or customs of the specific African country of origin as the primary determinant of marital validity within Alabama. This is a jurisdictional overreach, as Alabama law governs marital status within its borders, regardless of where the parties may have originated or where customs were practiced. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the governing jurisdiction, Alabama. They must then ascertain the specific legal requirements for marriage under Alabama law. Subsequently, they should gather information about the customary practice in question, focusing on its essential elements and how it manifests in practice. The critical step is to then analyze whether these customary elements align with or can be interpreted to satisfy the legal requirements of Alabama. This involves a nuanced understanding of both legal principles and cultural practices, aiming for a resolution that is legally sound and ethically considerate. Question 14. Compliance review shows that a couple residing in rural Alabama who identify with a specific African customary law tradition are seeking to end their marriage. They have followed the established customary procedures for divorce within their community, which involve mediation by community elders and a formal pronouncement of separation according to their traditions. What is the most appropriate course of action for a legal professional advising this couple regarding the implications and potential formalization of their separation under Alabama law? Option A. Advise the couple on how their customary divorce process aligns with or can be integrated with Alabama statutory divorce requirements for formal recognition, ensuring all legal rights and obligations are addressed under state law. Option B. Inform the couple that only the statutory divorce process under Alabama law is legally valid and that their customary divorce is not recognized. Option C. Proceed with filing a statutory divorce petition in Alabama without inquiring about or considering their customary divorce process. Option D. Advise the couple that their customary divorce is complete and legally binding within their community, and no further action is required under Alabama law. The correct answer is A. Advise the couple on how their customary divorce process aligns with or can be integrated with Alabama statutory divorce requirements for formal recognition, ensuring all legal rights and obligations are addressed under state law. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating the complexities of customary law within a specific geographic and cultural context, Alabama, while also considering the potential impact of statutory divorce proceedings. The challenge lies in accurately identifying and applying the relevant legal framework, ensuring that any separation process respects both customary practices and the rights afforded under Alabama law. Misapplication of either framework could lead to invalid divorce decrees, ongoing legal disputes, and significant emotional and financial distress for the parties involved. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough understanding and application of Alabama African Customary Law principles governing divorce and separation, while also acknowledging the potential need for statutory validation or recognition if the parties seek to formalize their separation under state law. This approach recognizes that customary practices often have deep cultural significance and may be the primary means by which individuals in the community resolve marital disputes. However, it also prudently considers the legal standing and enforceability of such separations within the broader Alabama legal system. This dual consideration ensures that the parties' customary rights are respected and that their separation is legally sound and recognized, preventing future complications. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the procedures of statutory divorce under Alabama law, without any consideration for the established African customary law practices of the community. This fails to acknowledge the deeply ingrained cultural and social norms that govern marital dissolution within that specific community, potentially leading to a separation that is not recognized or respected by the community itself, and may not adequately address the customary rights and obligations of the parties. Another incorrect approach would be to exclusively apply the principles of Alabama African Customary Law for divorce and separation, without any regard for the formal requirements or potential need for recognition under Alabama state statutes. Customary law may govern the internal community aspects of the divorce. Ignoring state law could render the separation legally unrecognized by the state, leading to issues with property division, child custody, and remarriage under Alabama law. A further incorrect approach would be to assume that all divorces within Alabama must follow the exact same statutory procedures, regardless of the party's cultural background or adherence to customary law. This overlooks the possibility of parallel legal systems or the recognition of customary practices within specific communities, leading to an imposition of a one-size-fits-all legal solution that may be culturally insensitive and legally incomplete. Professional reasoning. Professionals dealing with divorce and separation in Alabama, particularly in communities with strong customary law traditions, must adopt a hybrid approach. This involves first identifying the relevant customary law framework governing the parties' community. Simultaneously, they must be aware of the statutory divorce procedures in Alabama and advise clients on how customary separations can be integrated with or formally recognized by the state legal system to ensure full legal validity and protection of rights. This requires cultural competency, a nuanced understanding of both customary and statutory law, and a commitment to client-centered advice that respects both tradition and legal requirements. Question 15. Compliance review shows a situation in Alabama where a couple's marriage is recognized under their specific African customary law, but has not been formally registered under Alabama's statutory marriage laws. What is the most appropriate approach for determining the rights and obligations of these spouses concerning property acquired during the marriage? Option A. Conduct a thorough investigation into the specific customary laws governing their marriage and assess how Alabama statutes concerning property rights and family law might recognize or impact these customary entitlements. Option B. Apply general Alabama statutory marriage laws for property division as if it were a formally registered marriage, disregarding the customary nature of the union. Option C. Assume that because the marriage is not statutorily registered in Alabama, no legal rights or obligations regarding marital property exist for either spouse. Option D. Solely rely on the pronouncements of the community elders, who officiated the customary marriage to define the property rights of each spouse. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough investigation into the specific customary laws governing their marriage and assess how Alabama statutes concerning property rights and family law might recognize or impact these customary entitlements. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the intersection of customary law and statutory rights within Alabama. Determining the precise nature and extent of spousal rights and obligations in an African customary marriage, particularly when it has not been formally registered under Alabama law, requires careful consideration of both traditional practices and the legal framework that may recognize or impact such unions. The challenge lies in applying legal principles to a situation that may not fit neatly into conventional Western legal definitions, demanding a nuanced understanding of how customary practices are viewed and potentially enforced within the state's legal system. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a thorough investigation into the specific customs governing the marriage in question and an assessment of how Alabama law, particularly statutes concerning marriage, family law, and potentially property rights, might recognize or affect these customary rights and obligations. This requires consulting with legal experts familiar with both Alabama family law and the specific African customary traditions involved, and examining any relevant case law or legislative provisions that address customary marriages or the rights of spouses within them. The justification for this approach lies in its commitment to accurately understanding and applying the applicable legal and customary frameworks, ensuring that the rights and obligations of the spouses are determined based on a comprehensive and legally sound analysis, thereby upholding principles of fairness and due process. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the pronouncements of community elders or traditional leaders without cross-referencing them with Alabama statutory law. While customary law is important, Alabama law ultimately governs legal rights and obligations within the state. Ignoring statutory provisions could lead to an inaccurate determination of rights, potentially leaving one or both spouses without legal recourse or protection. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that because the marriage is customary and not formally registered under Alabama law, it carries no legal weight or confers no rights or obligations whatsoever. Alabama law may recognize certain aspects of customary unions, especially concerning issues like property division or child custody, even if they are not formally registered. A third incorrect approach would be to apply general principles of statutory marriage law without any consideration for the specific customary practices that define the union. This would fail to acknowledge the unique nature of the marriage and could lead to an inequitable outcome. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should adopt a structured decision-making process. First, they must identify the governing legal jurisdiction, Alabama, and the relevant legal frameworks, statutory marriage laws, family law, property law. Second, they must diligently research and understand the specific customary laws and practices applicable to the marriage in question. Third, they should seek expert advice from legal professionals who possess knowledge of both Alabama law and the relevant customary traditions. Finally, they must synthesize this information to determine the legally recognized rights and obligations of the spouses, ensuring that their advice or actions are grounded in both statutory law and a respectful understanding of customary practices. Question 16. Market research demonstrates that individuals of African descent in Alabama may have entered into marriages under customary law. In a situation involving the dissolution of such a marriage in Alabama, what is the most professionally appropriate method for a legal professional to address the parties' family law concerns? Option A. Apply Alabama's statutory divorce laws while equitably considering relevant aspects of the parties' African customary law practices that do not conflict with state statutes or public policy. Option B. Create a novel legal framework by arbitrarily combining elements of Alabama statutory law and African customary law to suit the specific case. Option C. Exclusively apply the principles of African customary law to resolve the divorce proceedings, ignoring Alabama's statutory divorce framework. Option D. Strictly adhere to Alabama's statutory divorce laws, disregarding any customary law practices the parties may have followed in their marriage. The correct answer is A. Apply Alabama's statutory divorce laws while equitably considering relevant aspects of the parties' African customary law practices that do not conflict with state statutes or public policy. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent complexities of applying Alabama African customary law within a modern legal framework, particularly concerning family law matters such as marriage dissolution. The challenge lies in balancing the recognition and application of customary practices with the statutory requirements and principles of fairness and equity that govern divorce proceedings in Alabama. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any resolution respects both the cultural heritage of the parties and the overarching legal obligations. The best professional approach involves a thorough understanding and application of Alabama's statutory divorce laws, while also acknowledging, and where legally permissible and equitable, considering relevant aspects of African customary law as they pertain to the parties' marital union and its dissolution. This approach is correct because Alabama law, while not explicitly codifying African customary law, recognizes the validity of customary marriages under certain circumstances and allows for the consideration of equitable principles in divorce. The legal framework in Alabama permits parties to present evidence regarding their customs and traditions, which may influence property division, spousal support, or child custody arrangements, provided these customs do not contravene public policy or statutory mandates. The professional's duty is to navigate these intersecting legal and cultural landscapes to achieve a just and legally sound outcome. An approach that solely relies on the strict application of Alabama's statutory divorce laws without any consideration for the party's African customary background would be professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from potentially ignoring the foundational validity of the marriage as understood by the parties and their community, leading to an outcome that may be perceived as unjust or culturally insensitive, even if technically compliant with statutory procedures. Risks overlooking factors that were integral to the marital agreement and expectations under customary law, which could have equitable implications. Another professionally unacceptable approach would be to exclusively apply African customary law principles to the divorce proceedings, disregarding Alabama's statutory divorce framework. This is a critical regulatory and ethical failure because Alabama courts operate under state statutes and common law. Customary law, while potentially influential in certain contexts, does not supersede the jurisdiction and mandates of the Alabama courts. Such an approach would render the proceedings legally invalid and unenforceable within the state's judicial system. A third professionally unacceptable approach involves attempting to synthesize or create a hybrid legal framework that arbitrarily blends elements of Alabama statutory law and African customary law without clear legal precedent or statutory authorization. This can lead to unpredictable and potentially unfair outcomes, as it lacks a solid legal foundation and could be challenged on grounds of procedural irregularity and substantive inequity. Professionals must operate within established legal parameters. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a multi-step approach. First, a comprehensive understanding of the Alabama statutory framework governing divorce. Second, diligent inquiry into the specific African customary laws and practices relevant to the party's marriage and its dissolution. Third, an assessment of how these customary practices might be equitably considered within the Alabama legal context, focusing on aspects that do not conflict with public policy or statutory requirements. And fourth, a commitment to achieving an outcome that is both legally compliant and fair to all parties involved, respecting their cultural backgrounds where legally permissible. Question 17. The risk matrix shows a potential for significant conflict arising from overlapping land claims within a rural community in Alabama, where traditional African customary law principles regarding land inheritance and usage are deeply ingrained and may conflict with formal state property law. Which of the following approaches would best facilitate a just and sustainable resolution to such land disputes in Alabama? Option A. A resolution based on a simple majority vote of community members, prioritizing immediate consensus over adherence to specific customary inheritance rules or state property statutes. Option B. Dismissal of all customary land claims as legally unenforceable without a detailed inquiry into their historical context and potential interplay with state law. Option C. Strict application of Alabama's statutory property law, disregarding any claims based on customary inheritance or usage rights. Option D. A facilitated mediation process involving community elders, customary law practitioners, and legal counsel knowledgeable in both customary and Alabama state property law to reconcile competing claims and ensure compliance with relevant statutes. The correct answer is D. A facilitated mediation process involving community elders, customary law practitioners, and legal counsel knowledgeable in both customary and Alabama state property law to reconcile competing claims and ensure compliance with relevant statutes. Explanation. The risk matrix shows a potential for significant conflict arising from overlapping land claims within a rural community in Alabama, where traditional African customary law principles regarding land inheritance and usage are deeply ingrained and may conflict with formal state property law. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating a complex interplay between established state legal frameworks and deeply rooted customary practices, demanding sensitivity to cultural norms while upholding legal obligations. A failure to properly address this could lead to protracted disputes, erosion of community trust, and potential legal challenges that are difficult to resolve under a single legal paradigm. The best approach involves a comprehensive, culturally sensitive mediation process that acknowledges and seeks to reconcile the principles of Alabama African customary law with relevant state statutes concerning property rights and land use. This method is correct because it directly addresses the dual legal and cultural dimensions of the dispute. By engaging community elders and recognized customary law practitioners, alongside legal counsel familiar with both customary and state law, it allows for a holistic understanding of the claims and facilitates a resolution that respects traditional inheritance patterns and communal land use rights, while also ensuring compliance with Alabama's property laws. This aligns with the ethical imperative to provide equitable and culturally appropriate dispute resolution, an approach that solely relies on applying Alabama's statutory property law without considering customary inheritance practices is professionally unacceptable. This fails to acknowledge the established customary rights and expectations of the community, potentially leading to a legally sound but culturally unjust outcome that exacerbates conflict and undermines the legitimacy of the resolution process within the community. It also risks violating the spirit of equitable dispute resolution by ignoring a significant aspect of the claimant's understanding of their rights. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to dismiss the customary claims entirely as legally invalid without a thorough examination of their historical basis and their potential recognition or influence under Alabama law, particularly in areas where customary practices have been historically tolerated or implicitly acknowledged. This demonstrates a lack of cultural competence and a failure to explore all avenues for a just resolution, potentially leading to protracted and acrimonious legal battles. A third professionally unacceptable approach is to impose a resolution based on majority opinion within the community without due consideration for the specific customary laws governing inheritance and land allocation, or without ensuring that all parties have had a fair opportunity to present their claims under both customary and state law frameworks. This can disenfranchise individuals or families who hold legitimate customary claims that may not align with the majority's immediate desires, leading to ongoing grievances. Professionals in this situation should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the specific customary laws at play, identifying the relevant Alabama state statutes, and then facilitating a dialogue that seeks to harmonize these two systems. This involves active listening, cultural humility, and a commitment to finding a resolution that is both legally sound and culturally resonant, thereby fostering long-term stability and community well-being. Question 18. Stakeholder feedback indicates a need to clarify the process for assessing and respecting African customary land rights in Alabama when considering new infrastructure projects. A development company is proposing a new commercial facility on land that has historically been used and occupied by an African American community under customary practices. What is the most appropriate and legally sound approach for the development company to take in Alabama? Option A. Proceed with the development based on the registered land titles, assuming that any customary claims are superseded by formal ownership, and offer compensation to any individuals who can demonstrate direct, documented ownership. Option B. Commission an independent archaeological survey to determine the historical significance of the land, and if significant findings are made, propose relocating the project to an alternative site without further engagement with the community regarding their land rights. Option C. Rely solely on a standard environmental impact assessment, which may briefly mention historical land use, and proceed with the project if no immediate environmental concerns are raised, assuming that customary land rights are not a primary legal consideration for infrastructure development. Option D. Conduct a thorough investigation into the nature and extent of the African customary land rights held by the community. Consult with community leaders and legal experts specializing in Alabama land law, and seek to negotiate mutually agreeable terms that respect these rights before proceeding with any development plans. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough investigation into the nature and extent of the African customary land rights held by the community. Consult with community leaders and legal experts specializing in Alabama land law, and seek to negotiate mutually agreeable terms that respect these rights before proceeding with any development plans. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the established rights of African customary landholders in Alabama with the potential for development and the legal frameworks governing land use. Navigating these competing interests demands a nuanced understanding of customary law, statutory land rights, and the ethical imperative to respect ancestral claims and community well-being. Misinterpreting or disregarding customary land rights can lead to significant legal disputes, community displacement, and reputational damage. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a comprehensive assessment that prioritizes the recognition and protection of existing African customary land rights as defined by Alabama law and relevant precedents. This approach necessitates direct engagement with the affected communities to understand the nature and extent of their customary claims, including historical usage, communal ownership structures, and traditional governance mechanisms. It requires consulting legal experts specializing in Alabama land law and customary practices to ensure all actions align with legal obligations and ethical considerations. This approach is correct because it directly addresses the core legal and ethical duty to uphold established rights, preventing potential infringements and fostering a process of informed consent and equitable benefit sharing, thereby adhering to the spirit and letter of Alabama's legal framework concerning indigenous and customary land tenure. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with development plans based solely on formal, registered land titles, without investigating or acknowledging potential overlapping or superior African customary land rights. This fails to meet the legal obligation to respect customary rights, which may not always be reflected in formal title deeds, and can lead to legal challenges and the invalidation of development projects. Another incorrect approach is to offer compensation to individuals without consulting the broader community or understanding the communal nature of customary land ownership. This can undermine traditional governance structures and fail to adequately address the collective rights and interests of the community, potentially leading to internal disputes and a lack of genuine consent. A further incorrect approach is to rely on external legal opinions that do not adequately consider the specific nuances of African customary law as it applies within Alabama, potentially leading to a misapplication of legal principles and a disregard for the unique rights of the landholders. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the specific legal and cultural context. This involves identifying all stakeholders, particularly the customary landholders, and engaging in transparent and respectful dialogue. A critical step is to conduct due diligence that extends beyond formal property records to include an investigation into customary land rights, consulting with community elders and legal scholars familiar with Alabama's specific legal landscape. Any proposed actions must be evaluated against the legal framework, protecting customary land rights and ethical principles of fairness and respect. Where potential conflicts arise, the priority should be to seek solutions that uphold existing rights and ensure equitable outcomes for the communities involved, potentially through collaborative planning or benefit-sharing agreements. Question 19. Regulatory review indicates that in Alabama, when determining child custody and guardianship matters involving families who adhere to African customary law, what is the most appropriate method for assessing and applying relevant customary principles? Option A. Conduct a comprehensive inquiry into the specific customary practices of the involved families within Alabama. Consult with recognized community elders or customary law practitioners to understand established norms, and then apply these principles in a manner that aligns with the paramount principle of the best interests of the child as interpreted under Alabama law. Option B. Solely rely on the pronouncements of a single, self-proclaimed elder from the community to determine the applicable customary law regarding child custody and guardianship. Option C. Disregard all African customary law principles and apply only the statutory provisions of Alabama without any consideration for the cultural context of the families involved. Option D. Assume that all traditional African customary practices related to child custody and guardianship are inherently beneficial and should be applied without further scrutiny or comparison to Alabama's legal standards for child welfare. The correct answer is A. Conduct a comprehensive inquiry into the specific customary practices of the involved families within Alabama. Consult with recognized community elders or customary law practitioners to understand established norms, and then apply these principles in a manner that aligns with the paramount principle of the best interests of the child as interpreted under Alabama law. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the intersection of traditional African customary law principles regarding child custody and guardianship with the evolving legal landscape in Alabama, which may incorporate statutory provisions or judicial interpretations that aim to protect the best interests of the child. Navigating this requires a deep understanding of both customary practices and the overarching legal framework to ensure decisions are both culturally sensitive and legally sound. prioritizing the child's welfare. The correct approach involves a thorough investigation into the specific customary practices of the involved families within Alabama, consulting with community elders or recognized customary law practitioners, and then applying these customary principles in a manner that aligns with the paramount principle of the best interests of the child as interpreted under Alabama law. This is correct because it respects the cultural heritage and established norms of the community while ensuring that the ultimate decision-making authority remains with the legal system, which is bound to prioritize the child's welfare. This dual consideration is essential for a just and legally compliant outcome. An incorrect approach would be to solely rely on the pronouncements of a single elder without verifying the consensus or established practice within the broader community, or without considering if such practices conflict with fundamental child protection principles enshrined in Alabama law. This fails to ensure a comprehensive understanding of customary law and risks, overlooking the legal obligation to protect the child. Another incorrect approach would be to disregard customary law entirely and apply only statutory provisions without any consideration for the cultural context of the families involved. This would be ethically problematic as it disrespects the community's traditions and could lead to outcomes that are alienating and disruptive to the child's familial and social environment, potentially not serving the child's best interests in a holistic sense. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to assume that all customary practices are inherently beneficial for child custody and guardianship without critical evaluation. This overlooks the possibility that some customary practices, while traditional, might not align with modern understandings of child welfare and protection, potentially exposing the child to harm or disadvantage. Professionals should approach such situations by first seeking to understand the specific customary laws and practices relevant to the families in question, engaging with community stakeholders to gain accurate insights, and then critically evaluating these practices against the established legal standards for child welfare in Alabama. This involves a process of informed inquiry, cultural sensitivity, and rigorous legal analysis to arrive at a decision that is both culturally appropriate and legally defensible, always with the child's best interests as the guiding principle. Question 20. Performance analysis shows that traditional dispute resolution systems for land matters within African customary communities in Alabama are facing increasing pressure from external economic development initiatives. To advocate for the continued relevance and potential integration of these systems, a quantifiable assessment of their economic efficiency is required. If a typical customary land dispute resolution process in an Alabama community takes an average of 4 months and incurs community resource costs equivalent to $200 Alabama dollars, while a comparable formal legal dispute in Alabama courts averages 3 years and incurs direct legal fees and associated costs of $500 Alabama dollars, and the average daily economic value of the land in dispute is estimated at $60 Alabama dollars. What is the total economic benefit per dispute resolution if the customary system is utilized instead of the formal court system? Option A, $12 $750 Alabama dollars. Option B, $12 $550 Alabama dollars. Option C, $12 $150 Alabama dollars. Option D, $11 $950 Alabama dollars. The correct answer is A, $12 $750 Alabama dollars. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the preservation of traditional Alabama African customary law with the practical realities of modern legal and economic systems. The introduction of external economic pressures, such as the need for verifiable land ownership for development and investment, directly conflicts with the fluid and community-based nature of customary land tenure. The challenge lies in finding a mechanism that respects the established dispute resolution processes, while also providing a framework that can be recognized and integrated into the broader legal and financial landscape of Alabama. This requires a nuanced understanding of both legal traditions and the economic drivers influencing land use. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves quantifying the economic value of land disputes resolved through traditional methods, and then projecting the potential economic impact of integrating these resolutions into a formal system. This requires calculating the average time and resources saved by using customary dispute resolution compared to formal litigation, and estimating the economic benefits of clear, recognized land titles for investment and development. For instance, if a customary resolution process takes an average of 3 months and costs $150 Alabama dollars in community resources, e.g., elder time, communal gatherings, and a formal legal dispute over the same issue in Alabama courts averages 2 years and costs $5,000 Alabama dollars. The savings per dispute are significant. The formula for calculating the economic benefit per dispute resolution would be // benefit per dispute equals // formal litigation cost / customary resolution cost plus / formal litigation time / customary resolution time times / average daily economic value of land / if the average daily economic value of the land in question is /50 Alabama dollars, then // benefit per dispute equals $5,000 $150 plus 2 / years 3 / months times $50 benefit per dispute equals $4 $850 plus 24 months 3 months times $50 benefit per dispute equals $4 $850 plus 21 months times $50 benefit per dispute equals $4 $850 plus $1 equals $5 900 This approach is correct because it provides a quantifiable basis for advocating for the integration of customary dispute resolution into formal systems. It demonstrates tangible economic advantages, aligning with the interests of developers, investors, and the state of Alabama, while also respecting the cultural and social fabric of the communities. This aligns with the principle of promoting efficient and equitable outcomes within the legal framework of Alabama, recognizing that economic viability is a key factor in the sustainability of any legal or social system. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to solely focus on the cultural and historical significance of traditional dispute resolution without considering its economic implications. While cultural preservation is important, failing to quantify the economic benefits or costs associated with these systems makes it difficult to gain support from stakeholders who prioritize economic development and investment within Alabama. This approach risks being perceived as impractical and out of touch with the realities of modern economic drivers. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss traditional dispute resolution entirely in favor of adopting a purely Western legal model for land disputes. This fails to acknowledge the existing, often effective, mechanisms within Alabama's African Customary Law. Such an approach would likely lead to significant social disruption, alienate communities, and disregard the established norms and trust built within these traditional systems. It also overlooks the potential for hybrid models that could leverage the strengths of both systems. A third incorrect approach is to attempt to impose external, standardized dispute resolution metrics without understanding the specific context and values of Alabama's African Customary Law. For example, using a rigid, time-bound arbitration model that does not account for community consensus building or the spiritual dimensions of land ownership would be inappropriate and ineffective. This approach fails to respect the unique characteristics of the customary system and would likely be rejected by the communities it aims to serve. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach this challenge by first conducting a thorough ethnographic and economic assessment of the traditional dispute resolution systems in Alabama. This involves understanding the processes, the resources involved, and the outcomes. Subsequently, they should engage in dialogue with community leaders, legal experts, and economic stakeholders to identify areas of potential synergy and conflict. The goal is to develop a proposal that quantifies the benefits of integrating or supporting customary dispute resolution, making a compelling case for its recognition and incorporation into the broader legal and economic framework of Alabama. This requires a blend of cultural sensitivity, legal acumen, and economic analysis.